Hey there, it's Brian here, and welcome to The Crown, a new Clash Royale podcast where each episode we pick a topic, a strategy, a deck, or a card, and we talk to somebody who knows it well. And for our first episode, we chose something that's essential to all battles in Clash Royale, something called Elixir Advantage.
So the entirety of Clash Royale is the expression of two players trying to convert Elixir into cards into damage. And they're just throwing stuff on the board all over the place, and you just get completely rolled, right? You only need about 5 to 6 Elixir to win the game.
This is Elixir Advantage on The Crown. So, if you were trying to learn about Elixir Advantage online like I was, especially early on, you would have noticed something similar between all the articles. And that's that the words were exactly the same, because they came from one place. 2 weeks after the soft launch of Clash Royale, there was a post on Reddit called "The Most Important Concept in Clash Royale, Elixir Advantage." It was by a guy called the Rum Ham.
Where's the rum? Rum Ham!
No! Frick, stay in the boat! Frick, stay in the boat!
Oh, Rum Ham! I'm sorry, Rum Ham! I'm sorry! Rum Ham!
When it comes to Elixir Advantage, I knew who I wanted to talk to.
Hey guys, I'm the Rum Ham, also known as Seth. I'm a former game designer who left the game industry to go into esports and streaming. I'm also a coach on Mastery GG, as well as a content creator on YouTube, a streamer on Twitch, and I still kind of do game design from time to time, so yes. A Renaissance man if Renaissance people played video games.
So before there was Clash Royale, or Clash of Clans, or cell phones, there was a collectible card game called Magic: The Gathering, a game that Seth has been playing on and off since the early 90s, since he was 5.
Nowadays, there's so much theory, deck building theory, game theory, all of that around Magic: The Gathering, because you just have 20 plus years of accumulated knowledge. And I knew when I played Clash Royale that some of these concepts would still apply. The most common one in Magic is called card advantage, which is essentially the same thing. Like, if we both start with 7 cards and we draw cards one at a time. If I can kill 2 of your cards for 1 of my cards, eventually you're not going to have any cards in hand, and I'm going to have a couple, and I'm just going to win the game on the back of having 3 cards in hand when you have none. But because Clash Royale, card drawing is not the per-turn resource. Instead, it's, you just always draw a new card when you play one. Card advantage didn't really apply. So I sort of thought about, what's the consistent resource in this game that both players have a balance of, and how could I tip that balance in my favor? And that's when I started thinking about Elixir Advantage and how it applied to Clash Royale. Everyone starts with the same amount of Elixir and gains Elixir at the same rate. The only way to deal damage is to convert Elixir into cards and then cards into damage. So the entirety of Clash Royale is the expression of two players trying to convert Elixir into cards into damage. Well, the concept of Elixir Advantage then is, how can you spend less Elixir than your opponent countering their cards? Even if both of your cards deal no damage to either tower, if you spent 5 and I spent 2, I now just have 3 extra Elixir, and at some point I will be able to take that extra Elixir and really beat you over the head with it.
Does that make sense? It's all about having effective counters to your opponent's cards that cost you less than what they paid for their cards. And once you accumulate an advantage, they're not going to have enough Elixir to respond with, and you get to cash in the advantage for the win.
You only need about 5 to 6 Elixir to win the game. Like, to take a tower, I guess is a better way to put it. 5 to 6 Elixir is all you really need to take a tower, but it's only a handful of cards that can do that, right? Like Elite Barbarians, your Giants, and things like that. And usually, people are going to defend. Well, if you think about the tower as sort of, these are the Elixir drains. These are the things that take away Elixir off the board at no cost to their owner. A small defense or a tower shooting for a long time is probably going to earn, quote unquote, 2 to 3 Elixir on its own. So if you have an Elixir advantage of 5 or 6, you might think yes, I can just take a tower, boom, giant. But when you do that, the tower is going to take some of that Elixir off the board just by shooting your stuff down. So if you can get in some situation where you're up by like 5, 6, 7 elixir, that might not be enough to win the game right there, but it can be enough to push the damage over multiple times per game. Like, okay, I have a 4 elixir advantage now, I do a 30-year tower, get a 4 elixir advantage later, boom, take another 30-year tower. And do that enough times to take a tower and ideally win the game, 1-0 or 2-1 or whatever. But this is all like very academic, you know what I mean? Like in the actual heat of battle, things don't always go this way. But one of the purest decks that show this off is simply Elixir Collector decks. There's plenty of decks out there that will play an Elixir Collector down. You attack with Hog Rider. They defend with whatever, right? And as long as they defend for 3 or 4 or less, rather, and they get to keep that Elixir Collector on the board without taking a ton of damage in response for playing it, they get to get a second Elixir Collector out. And then eventually a third one if you really don't even answer that. And they get to a point where suddenly they just have like a full bar of Elixir when you're at 2, and they're just throwing stuff on the board all over the place, and you just get completely rolled, right? One additive unit in a push could be the difference in an entire battle, and those decks just feel like they have it every time.
So a common question with Elixir Collectors is it worth nerfing them? Like if you can get a Fireball in on the Collector and on the Tower, does that become an effective trade?
It's actually a pretty fair trade, because by playing Elixir Collector, I'm going to gain a +2 Elixir trade. By you playing Fireball, you do 5 pumps worth of damage to it. It takes it down to only, I guess I lose half the advantage. I spend 4, I take 5 away from you, but you had spent 5 to gain 7, so really you're only going to get 1 elixir more in this exchange when all the numbers are sort of evened out, but I get to do 200 damage to your tower. I think that's actually a pretty fair trade, which is why the decks that you see Elixir Collector the most in are ones that can punish the Fireball. Like 3 Musketeer decks, for example, are really popular with Elixir Collector, because if you do choose to Fireball the Elixir Collector, they sort of have this trump card to slam on the board at the moment that you don't have that card in hand. So they take that, usually a pretty fair trade for the Fireball user, and flip it on its head by being like, nah, I have Barbarians in the deck, I have 3 Musketeers in the deck. If you Fireball, you're done for.
This is kind of like another concept that you mentioned in there, is baiting your opponent to play their counter.
Yeah, that's something that's not really related to Elixir Advantage all the time, but that is a fundamental aspect of control decks. And control decks are decks that really leverage Elixir Advantage more than any other archetype. Like, just as an example, beatdown decks are trying to put together this massive push that kind of has everything covered. Like, Giant is obviously the thing that deals with the tower. Well, then Mega Minion and Musketeer are the support that kind of kill anything you play, and even if you spend the same elixir or more, the multifaceted aspect of the push, along with like a Fireball or a Poison, is supposed to just deal with everything. It doesn't really matter how much elixir I spend, because I'll just lightning it off the board with my Giant and Mega Minion, whatever. Right? That's just the plan of a beatdown deck. Control decks, on the other hand, want to try to counter any sort of push you're throwing at them for less elixir, and then do something with that elixir advantage. And one of the ways to make that really valuable, to make a 4 elixir advantage something that you can win the game off of, you can bait out certain counters. Like a deck can only have 8 cards, and a lot of times people will only play 1 of a certain type of card in their deck. So for example, they'll just only have Zap, and that's the only spell in their deck. Well, if I have 2 cards that you should probably answer with Zap, you can probably adapt to that. You zap one of them, and then you use one of your troops or other cards to sort of fill in for Zap in some other situation. Okay, I've got minions. Minions will kill all the little things, so I don't have to worry about Zap against the goblins or whatever. But if I have 3 cards, it's a lot more challenging for you to use your Zap. If I have 4 or 5 cards, then suddenly these cards that on their own are pretty balanced can feel completely overpowered, because you're playing on the ability of someone only having 1 answer to your card. And that's something that if control decks can sit back and just generate a 3 elixir advantage and get the Zap out of your hand at the same time, well then suddenly Goblin Barrel isn't just a 3 elixir like Fireball worth of damage, it's significantly more than that.
So I get the idea of Elixir Advantage, and I get making Elixir positive trades. But as you can tell through the examples, pretty quickly it becomes difficult to track. So what would be nice is if there was a way that you could tell who has the Elixir Advantage and by how much?
That's super easy. Now, this is a little bit of poker here, right? So is there a 100% serious way? No, not at all. But there's a little bit of poker you can do. If your opponent plays something like an Elixir Collector or a Furnace or like a Giant behind their King Tower, anything that sort of indicates to you that they are at 10 Elixir, look at your Elixir at the moment they do it. If you're at 8 and they just played a Giant behind their King Tower, they're probably 2 Elixir ahead of you. Because most rational players, right, quote unquote, most people playing totally rationally are only going to do a move like that when they're at 10 Elixir. So if they do that, you can probably take that as a signal that they're not bluffing you, that they're probably at 10 Elixir and just aren't sure what to do, so they're starting to build a big push. And if you are at 8 or 9 Elixir, then you can tell they're a little bit ahead of you. Conversely, same thing, right? Like you're at 10 Elixir, you drop a Giant behind your King Tower, start counting Elixir until they play something. Because something like a Giant behind the King Tower is not... If they don't just play something at the river, like if they don't just come and punish you right away, like they drop Hog Rider, Ice Golem, or whatever in the other lane, if they wait a beat or two, then whenever they play something, they were probably also at 10 Elixir. So if you play a Giant behind the King Tower, and you watch your Elixir go to 5, right, and then up to 6, and then up to 7, and then they play something, you can assume that you are 2 Elixir ahead of them.
So basically, anytime the game comes down to a pause is your opportunity to decide who has the advantage.
Right. And of course, there's always situations where this may, like, if I drop a Giant behind my King Tower and my opponent goes Ice Golem, Hog Rider, well, like, who knows, right? Like, they could be at exactly 6 Elixir, or they could have hit 10 at the exact same time as me. The overriding thing that happened there was that because I went low on Elixir, there was an opportunity for him to attack. But in situations, where both players are playing very passively and sitting back and building up towards big stuff, you can get a little bit of a read on your opponent's status by, the timing of the two players putting their big investments down.
When you're building your deck, is there like a ratio that you stick to for proactive and reactive cards, or is it really dependent on the style of the deck that you're playing?
It really depends on the style of the deck and really what you're planning to do. Like, for example, Giant, or like, let's go real big. Let's go like the biggest beatdown deck, like big O fat golem pusher tower over decks. Just play very differently from those high tempo, like minor zap bait aggro decks, which also play very different from Expo decks, which are kind of a quintessential, siege variant. So it's hard to say like, oh, I sit down to build a deck and I must have the exact same ratio of certain cards across all of these different archetypes, because each game style is so, distinctly different from each other in the moment. I think what helps, as just a very broad stroke general rule, is to not get too caught up in trying to play a bunch of high cost cards. There was sort of there's a concept in Magic the Gathering, to go back to card games, is that you should always play 60 cards in your deck, because that's the minimum. You can play more than that. You're allowed to play 61, 70, 800 cards in your Magic deck in a tournament if you want, but people always say, like, play 60 cards. And a lot of new players will go, oh, I really like all these different cards, so can't I just get away with like 63 or 62 or what have you? And say no, because if you are willing to have a 61st or 62nd card, then your deck is getting somewhat worse, because there has to be a worst card in the deck. And if you cut that, then your deck gets marginally better, right? Like always trying to play at this minimum here. Now, that point in the Clash Royale is that you probably can put together a 2 and 3 card combination that is really, really powerful. You should just stick to that 2 to 3, maybe 4 card combination win condition, and then fill the rest of your deck with cheap utility cycle cards. So Ice Spirit, Ice Golem, Zap, Log, these cards are really popular not just because they're good, but because they're cheap. And what that allows you to do is, for example, if I wanted to play a Giant deck with a ranged attacker, it might say, oh, well, you know what? I like Wizard, but I'm also going to play Witch. I'm going to play Wizard and Witch and Giant in the deck. Well, what are the odds you're going to need both of those cards? Like, probably pretty low. You're better off just playing Wizard and Ice Golem or Zap or something. Because if you really need Wizard, like one of those two is better for your deck, right? It's either Witch or Wizard. So let's just say it's Wizard for this example. You'd be better off being able to cycle back and get to your Wizard again than you would be playing a worse Wizard in your deck and having your deck be slower to get through it if you ever need to get back to a crucial card. So you've got 8 cards. Each of those cards can really fill a role. You're probably better off with like cheap multi-utility cycle cards than you would be playing like 2 of some big dumb card that like does the same thing as some other card in your deck, which is somewhat unfortunate for deck building because over a long enough period of time, all decks are going to kind of boil down to this, right? Like, let's say every deck runs Ice Golem, Zap, Mega Minion, and yeah, let's just say those 3 cards. And the other 5 cards are kind of up for negotiation. Well, if they come out with more Ice Golem sort of cards, or if you happen to play these other like logs and, you know, cannons, tombstone, these sort of cheap multi-use cards, eventually the deck building really just comes down to like, all right, my 3 core cards are Lava Hound, Balloon, and like Freeze. And the other guy's like, all right, mine's Bowler, Graveyard, and Fireball, or whatever. So I think that's going to be a big challenge moving forward with Clash Royale, is trying to introduce low-cost cards to the game that also don't dominate the meta too harsh.
What are the most versatile reactive cards that you should have? I guess it's kind of those ones you just mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, that's what makes those cards so powerful, is that they do multiple things and they're cheap. So even if you get caught in a low... like, okay, so actually this goes back to the Elixir thing we were saying, the Elixir Collector. 5 isn't that hard to defend with. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, I mean is when there are a huge variety of 1, 2, and 3 cost cards that are good on defense, being left with 5 Elixir regularly allows me to play at least 2 cards, and sometimes 3, depending on the costs and things like that, of usually a selection of cards. So let's say my deck does have Zap and Ice Golem and Tombstone and Ice Wizard. That's my hand. All 2 and 3 cost cards. And then the last card I had played was an Elixir Collector. So boom, I'm down to 5. My hand is those 4 cards. And you attack me. Well, like, what could you possibly throw at me that Ice Golem, Zap, Tombstone, and Ice Wizard, some pick 2 combination of those cards, couldn't reasonably deal with, or at least stall until either I gained more Elixir to play something else, or I was willing to take some damage, but ultimately my tower would help finish it off, right? And on top of being like, oh, I can usually defend anything with 5 Elixir and those collection of cards, because they're cheap, I got to play 2 of them, which means I'm already halfway back to my Elixir Collector, which is sort of the 3, one of the core cards in the deck that I'm really just trying to get back to over and over again.
So another section that I like from Seth's post is when he outlines the 3 resources that you have to trade with in battle. You have Elixir, the hit points of your towers, and time. So first let's talk about how you can buy Elixir Advantage back with the hit points of your tower.
Well, here's a really simple one, right? Goblins are coming at your tower. You do not have Zap in hand, right? You only have, let's say, 3 Elixir and up cards. Well, you can really ask yourself, like, well, is it worth it to take 200 to 300 damage and keep 3 Elixir in my hand? Or is it better to put 3 Elixir on the board and fight these goblins, and it's an Elixir negative trade, but I don't take any damage? So that's a situation where, depending on what your game plan is, like for example, if one tower is heavily damaged and the other tower is at kind of high health, it might be worth it just to let those goblins through on the high health tower, because that just might be a distraction or a feint or a thing that's trying to get you to put your Elixir in both lanes. If you're saving up towards 10, it might just be better to let that happen so you can put your golem down sooner, if that makes sense. Another one is often Miner. Miner is a card that actually isn't very threatening all on its own. It doesn't generate, that much of a good damage to cost ratio. It's usually the support that's coming in after the Miner. So a lot of times you'll see people spend a lot of Elixir just to kill the support, and then sort of leave the Miner alone and just let it do its like 300-400 damage to the tower. And you instead save the Elixir they would spend on attacking the Miner on the counterattack that is brewing from killing all the support troops.
A good quote from your post was when you said, your towers are big boys, they can take care of themselves.
Yeah, I mean, Defender's Advantage in Clash Royale is the highest in any game I've ever played, ever seen, ever been a competitive player of, anything like that. Like, the Defender's Advantage is so amazing in Clash Royale. Your towers do like musketeer level damage or something. It's crazy. Like, it's a little bit different from level to level, because as you level up, your towers actually get a little bit weaker. But from pretty much level 1 in Clash Royale all the way through tournament cap, your towers are easily the best card in the game. So part of the reason why a lot of these cycle cards are so good and why defense is so strong in Clash Royale is that something like Ice Golem that doesn't even attack ends up doing a lot of indirect damage, because for every second that you're keeping things off your tower is generating additive damage to it. So things like Ice Golem, for example, buy a good amount of time, and then they die and deal a little bit of damage, and then they slow, which creates even more, time for your tower to generate that extra damage. And I don't even know. Could you guess how many times per game your tower shoots?
No idea.
Right, like no idea, right? Like, but it's probably 60, 70 times through a game. And of course, if it's late in overtime, it might even be up into 90 or 100 times per game. And also depending on the kind of archetypes you guys are playing. So you're talking about literally thousands, more than a tower's health multiplied several times over. Thousands upon thousands of free damage generated from your towers. And a lot of defending in Clash Royale is like, how are you distributing that damage? Are you doing a good job of it? Obviously, if a lot of that damage is just going into giant chests, it doesn't really matter. But if it's going towards minions and ranged attackers or hog riders and things like that, it's actually very beneficial.
One thing that might not be as easy to conceptualize is, how are you trading for time? Do you mean that you're buying time?
Sort of. Time has... There's two large elements of time in Clash Royale. Elixir is generated at a steady time rate. So Elixir represents time all on its own, and you get one Elixir every 3 seconds or so. If you don't want to play with your Elixir right now, like for example, because the Defender's Advantage is so strong, you don't just want to play your whole hand at the river because you know that their defense plus the tower is just going to kill all your stuff and then you're going to get counterattacked, then one of the ways you play with time is by putting Elixir into the future. This is by putting tanks behind your King Tower or putting buildings on the board, spawner buildings or Elixir Collector on the board. If you count up the number of barbarians you get, for example, from Barbarian Hut, you get about 12 and a half Elixir worth of barbarians. So you spend 7 and you're going to get almost double that amount trickled out over time. But when you do that, you make yourself very vulnerable for a short period of time. So there's this little trade-off of time where when I play a Furnace or a Barbarian Hut or especially something defenseless like an Elixir Collector, I'm sort of signaling to my opponent that, like, I'm not trying to play for right now, I'm trying to play for the future. But you can't really do that, for example, if the clock's about to run out. You know what I mean? So you early in the game, you tend to play for the future. Now, when I say, hey, opponent, I'm playing for the future by investing Elixir on the board, my opponent can say, you know what? We're going to play right now and go for a really aggressive push when they know that I'm low on Elixir. Now, this is a situation where you may not care so much about Elixir Advantage. Like, I might be willing to spend 9 Elixir, or 10, like let's say, you went down to 5. I might be willing to spend all 10 of my Elixir, and you spend all of your 5, and even though that is a -5 Elixir trade, if I can take that tower, if I can convert that extra 5 Elixir that I'm losing into 500 damage per Elixir that I wasted, that's a really good ratio of Elixir to damage, and I take the tower and then I'm happy. Then I just have to defend the rest of the game. So that's a little bit of the trade-offs there. Now, however, if my opponent attacks and I defend it, I don't take that much damage, then they probably did lose Elixir, and they might have even done some damage, but how much damage do they actually gain for the Elixir lost? If it wasn't that good, if it wasn't some large exchange, then might not have been worth it for them, or at least my expert defense allowed me to survive that moment of vulnerability, and now the game plan to play into the future is much safer.
I started to see arguments come up on Reddit about Elixir Advantage, and people are saying you're thinking about this too black and white. You don't have to always pick the least expensive card because there can be residual effects. And a good example is someone says they play Minion Horde and Barbarians in the same lane, and you have your Fireball or you have a Wizard. Now, if you have something that you can use to lead that Wizard with, you play that Wizard, it takes out all the troops with its splash damage, but then now you can drop a Giant in front of it, And so you paid one more elixir initially, but you also lined up your strike.
Yeah, and that is a key aspect of reaction cards, right? Like, here's a great example for you. Here's one of my favorite things. Elite Barbarians are actually not a very good proactive card. If you just play Elite Barbarians at the river, there's a million ways for these things to get countered, usually for less elixir, and sometimes for the same or more elixir, but with a counterattack. So they're actually not very good proactive cards, but they're amazing reactive cards. If an opponent plays a miner at my tower and I drop Elite Barbarians, that in the concept of Elixir Advantage is like a terrible trade, right? Like, I spent 6 to counter 3, what are you doing? But if I know that I'm going to kill that miner, take no damage on my tower, and a very minuscule amount of damage on one Barbarian, then I essentially have now a full 6-cost Elite Barbarians that I would play at the river. I got it for only 3 elixir because I countered his miner, give me a 3 elixir discount on my elite barbs, and now even if they do all the same stuff, Tombstone, Skeleton Army, Log, whatever, in order to kill my elite barbarians, it's very likely that was an elixir neutral or maybe even elixir positive trade overall, because I used the elite barbarians on defense first to remove some of my opponent's proactive elixir, and then whatever he had to do to stop the counterattack can be counted towards that entire exchange.
So I think Elixir Advantage is like the fundamental. It starts there, but it gets super complicated.
Yeah, the formula, we mentioned it a little bit. We kind of tapped around it, and I really don't know what the answer is here. I don't know what the formula is. Maybe it changes from each different deck, but there has to be some amount of damage per elixir cost that I would be willing to exchange, elixir for damage and win the game on that. Spells are clearly below this threshold because I would not fireball a tower. Just a tower, right? So if that's 4 elixir for 230 damage, then clearly 50 damage per elixir is too low. That's not worth the exchange. I would have to spend 50 elixir in order to kill these towers, or the 2,500 health tournament cap towers, and I cannot generate a 50 elixir advantage. So Rocket, even though Rocket does a bunch of damage, that's closer to 1-to-1. It's still not right. So I would assume that the number is something over 100, but even that seems wrong because I can't generate a 25 elixir advantage. So something around, like, ideally you would want to get 500 damage per elixir, because that means that a single 5 elixir troop can kill the tower if unanswered, and that sounds about right, because Hog Rider almost kills a tower, Elite Barbarians and Giant definitely kill a tower, an unanswered P.E.K.K.A. or things like that, like, absolutely kill a tower, Mini P.E.K.K.A. falls a little short, you know what I mean? Like, there's definitely, like, this sounds about right, but the trick is how do you generate that? Well, beatdown decks are trying to just have such an overwhelming push that they do it all at once. Like, they have a 5 elixir advantage at the moment of their big push, and all at once they just roll over the tower. Control decks are probably trying to get that in chippy small amounts. So, for example, I counter your musketeer that's crossing the river with a mini P.E.K.K.A., and even if 3 out of 4 times you block the mini P.E.K.K.A., if 1 out of 4 times it gets a hit, then I'm like, sweet. That was a whole bunch of elixir neutral trades that somehow generated like 800 damage once. Great. Another one might be like when you use Prince against a Giant, and Prince kills Giant 5 for 5, and they either lose elixir on defending the counterattack, or they let it hit their tower, and then you're thrilled, right? There's got to be a lot of situations like that happen multiple times a game. A good example might even be something like when you miner fireball an elixir collector, right? They play elixir collector, you play miner, they play a defender, and you just like fireball the whole thing, and you kill the elixir collector and hit the tower. Like, that probably all shakes out to you spending maybe like the same or a little less elixir, or maybe like 1 more elixir than what they played, but you're thrilled because you did 200 damage to their tower, 230 damage to their tower. So 1 elixir for 230 damage, yeah, that's pretty good. Like, I'll take that. Rocket clearly is awesome when you rocket an elixir collector, because then it's a 6 for 6, but you get 500 damage. So for 0 elixir, you get 500. Lightning makes sense because even if they get 1 pump, so you're 1 elixir down, you did 350 damage to your tower. So you're happy at 350 damage for 1 elixir. So I don't exactly know, right? There's like, this is just mostly food for thought for the listeners, is to think about, even if you're willing to take an elixir disadvantage on a trade, what are you really getting for it? Because if you dump all your elixir and you spend your entire elixir advantage, but only get about 50 to 100 damage for that, that probably wasn't a good trade, and it could come back to bite you and lose the game later if your opponent can exchange elixir into cards into damage at a higher rate than that.
Man, you can crunch those numbers like right as you go. Like you barely pause for a second and say, okay, that's 250, that's this. Like,
yeah, I've thought about this a bit.
I think we've covered Elixir Advantage pretty well. Is there any one tip that you would give? Maybe something we haven't touched on?
The hardest thing for me to do myself, so sort of an advanced skill that you should really take advantage of and try to improve on your own end, and something that I still do terribly after a year of playing Clash Royale, I still walk into this all the time, is it's easy to look at your opponent and think, I'm looking at my cards, I look at my opponent's board, I see an elixir positive trade here. Boom. It's much harder when you are making decisions to put yourself in your opponent's shoes and make sure that you're not setting up an elixir positive trade for them. Classic example of this is, you have a furnace in the middle, some sort of building in the middle, and then you end up playing your archers in between the furnace and the tower. And your opponent just fireballs the archers, the tower, the furnace, all for 4 elixir. They are thrilled, right? Even if they would have never fireballed the tower alone, they would have maybe not have fireballed the furnace and the tower, but as soon as you drop the archers there, they have no choice except to take that immense amount of value for their elixir to do that. They spend, only 1 more elixir than your archers, but they get 230 on the tower. They take about half the health off the furnace. That's amazing for them. And that was all because you, the player, set that up for them. You know what I mean? There's no game rule that was going to make that happen. It was simply your own mistakes. So not only should you look for elixir positive trades, but really be cognizant of how cards interact with each other. Don't put Skeleton Army in front of a witch and things like that, which is kind of obvious, but you'd be surprised how often that happens. Like, don't drop your Skeleton Army around a near-dead golem, because the golem's going to blow up, and did you even get enough damage out of that Skeleton Army before it died to be worth the 3 elixir you spent on it?
If people want to get more coaching from you, or if they want to find your channels, if they're not already following you, what are your main streams that we can follow you on?
I offer coaching lessons. So it's funny, I'm a YouTuber and a streamer, and I feel like it's very disjointed when you're on streams, right? You're talking, you get to chat, you're trying to play, there's just so much stuff going on. But you can actually hire me for one-on-one coaching at mastery.gg. You can find my coach profile under Clash Royale, and either book a private one-on-one lesson, which is more like this, where we talk about thought processes and decision making and how to build better decks and how to become better players. Or if you just love the pure entertainment or want to see me play some decks, go check out my YouTube channel, which the username is the Rum Ham. And there's got billions of videos on there of different decks and strategies and sneak previews and all that stuff. And you can catch me live on Twitch as well, the Rum Ham. I stream from 8 to 11 a.m. Pacific time, just in the morning. Just wake up, load that computer up, and start playing right away. So if you're at your desk, you're at school, you're at your office, come have some rum, ham, and eggs in the morning.
Thanks for listening, and thank you to everybody that helped make this first episode happen. Rum Ham was a lot of fun. He's super knowledgeable. He's high energy. I recommend you check out his coaching, his streams. Also check out that song that we played at the intro. That's the Clash Royale theme song, Trap Remix by Seko. All the other music in today's episode was provided by Jay Haas. We've got links to his music on our website, as well as Rum Ham stuff. It's crownpodcast.com. Check it out. Also, subscribe in iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. If you really like the show, give us a rating or a review. If you have feedback or suggestions, you can email the king at crownpodcast.com. That guy loves to get email. Anyway, thanks for listening. This has been The Crown, a Clash Royale podcast.